I was standing in my own wedding photo, yet they'd cropped half my face out before posting it online. That was the first warning. The second came when my mother-in-law raised her champagne glass in front of a room full of people and said, "You're not really family, dear." Laughter followed. I smiled back, swallowing the heat in my chest. They didn't know the loan application they were desperately preparing was about to land on my desk. And when they stepped into that glass-walled office, they'd finally understand whose name was written above the door, mine. Daniel and I were the picture of elegance as we walked into the reception hall that glowed under a cascade of crystal chandeliers. He carried himself with that easy grace I'd fallen for, and I stayed close, smiling for the cameras. From the outside, we were the fairy tale. Him, the charming youngest son of a wealthy family, me, the polished newcomer who had somehow slipped past the gates of their world. My dress shimmered under the lights, and every laugh, every nod was perfectly timed. But beneath the gloss, I felt the weight of every gaze measuring, judging. A week later, Evelyn posted a series of photos from our wedding on Instagram. In one of them, Daniel's arm was wrapped around me, his face angled toward the camera. My face, however, was neatly cropped, replaced by a blurred background of white roses. I stared at the image on my phone, my coffee cooling in my hand. The caption read, "What a perfect day for our family." I scrolled through the comments, compliments about Daniel, about Evelyn's dress, about the beautiful family. My name wasn't mentioned once. The first real crack appeared at the family welcome party. The room was filled with relatives, business associates, and the faint smell of expensive perfume. Evelyn floated toward me, a glass of champagne in hand, her pearl earrings catching the light. She leaned in, close enough for the guests nearby to hear, and said, "You're just a temporary guest here, dear." Her voice was sweet, but her words sliced like glass. The laughter that followed felt rehearsed, a cruel punchline everyone but me was in on. I swallowed the sting and returned her smile. Later that evening, as the chatter swelled and champagne flutes clinked, I caught sight of a man at the far end of the room, holding up his phone. He was recording, amused by the tension he'd just witnessed. I thought nothing of it until 2 days later when my phone began to buzz nonstop. A video of Evelyn's remark had surfaced on TikTok, paired with the hashtag #NotFamily. It spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views and thousands of comments. Strangers rallied behind me, dissecting the insult, analyzing the smug curve of Evelyn's smile. I didn't engage. Silence was my sharpest weapon. While the world speculated, I sat in my office, my real office, far from the marble corridors of the Morgan estate. Screens glowed with numbers, stock movements, and encrypted messages from my partners. Few knew that I had quietly built and sold a financial technology company before marrying Daniel. Fewer still knew that I'd taken those millions and invested them into a digital banking platform, eventually securing controlling interest in a regional bank. It wasn't a vanity project, it was a fortress, one I had no intention of revealing yet. The public drama was entertaining to many, but for me, it was a distraction from something far more pressing. That afternoon, my assistant walked in, her face unreadable, and placed a folder on my desk. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said. Inside were the details of a new loan application. The client? Morgan and Hale Real Estate Development. Evelyn's pride and joy. I skimmed the figures. The numbers were dire. Over-leveraged assets, stalled projects, and debt payments they could no longer meet. The application had been expedited, flagged as urgent, and according to procedure, it would be routed directly to the desk of the bank's largest shareholder for final approval. That was me. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the city faint through the glass walls. The Morgans had spent months reminding me I didn't belong, that my presence was tolerated at best. Now they were about to walk into my domain, unaware that the decision they desperately needed was mine to make. I traced my finger over the company's name on the application, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile curved my lips. They thought they knew who I was. Soon they would understand exactly what it meant to be part of my family. I decided the next move had to be quiet. No confrontations, no open defiance, just a slow peeling away of their confidence. Over Sunday brunch at the estate, I played my role flawlessly. I asked Evelyn questions that sounded harmless, even flattering. How do you manage such large developments without drowning in the paperwork? I asked, tilting my head like a curious student. She laughed, taking the bait, and began explaining, more than she realized, about current projects, the strain of delayed permits, and a key investor who had pulled out. Daniel barely noticed. He was busy recounting golf stories to his father. Later, while Evelyn inspected the dessert tray, I slipped away to the veranda and checked my phone. The online storm hadn't died down. If anything, it had intensified. Thousands of strangers had taken my side, turning the video from the welcome party into a symbol of every slighted daughter-in-law in America. My inbox was overflowing with messages from anonymous sources claiming they had inside knowledge about Morgan and Hale's debts. One email stood out. It was from someone who claimed to work in the company's accounting department. Attached was a PDF file labeled, "For Your Eyes Only." I downloaded it, scanning the rows of figures, the overdue payments, the unpaid contractors. It was worse than I'd imagined. Not only were they underwater on several properties, but they'd also used personal assets as collateral, assets Evelyn could not afford to lose. That night, I lay awake, my mind replaying the same old film from my childhood, the moments in which people dismissed me because my family wasn't wealthy, the parties I wasn't invited to, the scholarships I had to fight for while others inherited their opportunities. I had sworn never to let anyone decide my worth again. This was no longer just about dignity. It was about control. The next morning, I sat in my office at the bank's downtown headquarters and pulled out a legal pad. I began listing every resource I had at my disposal. Majority shares in the bank, yes. A venture capital fund specializing in real estate tech. Equity in a fintech startup that processed payments for half the city's high-end retailers. Multiple shell companies owning key properties. Each asset was another card in my hand, waiting to be played. But I didn't want to play alone. This battle needed witnesses, and more importantly, an amplifier. That's when I thought of Alex Carter, a journalist whose investigative work had taken down a fraudulent charity 2 years earlier. We'd met briefly at a conference, and I'd been impressed by his precision. I sent him a discreet message. "I have a story you'll want, but it's not ready yet. I need you to be patient." He called within an hour. "Give me a hint," he said. "It's about one of the city's most respected real estate families," I replied. "And it's going to shake their foundation, literally." His silence told me I had his full attention. Over the next week, I fed him bits of information, nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to keep him interested. In parallel, I tightened my own defenses, moving certain assets into trusts, ensuring that if the Morgans tried to retaliate legally, they'd find nothing to seize. The day the loan file reached my desk, I wasn't surprised. It was thick with paperwork, but the desperation bled through every page. Evelyn's signature was scrawled at the bottom, bold and confident, as though she still believed the universe revolved around her. I traced the ink with my finger, imagining her expression when she realized whose hands her fate rested in. That afternoon, as I reviewed the file, my assistant buzzed me. "Mrs. Morgan is here to see you," she said, her tone carrying the faintest trace of amusement. I glanced at the glass wall of my office. Through it, I could see Evelyn in the waiting area, dressed in her usual tailored perfection, her pearls catching the light. She was scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the fact that the door she was about to walk through didn't lead to another faceless banker. It led to me. I closed the loan file and leaned back in my chair. "Send her in," I said, my voice calm but my pulse steady and deliberate. The game we'd both been pretending not to play was about to change forever. The morning after Evelyn's visit, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen island, laptop open, coffee steaming in his hand. "We might have to refinance the Hale project," he said, scrolling through spreadsheets. "XYZ Bank has been pretty competitive lately. Maybe they could work with us." I kept my expression neutral, stirring my tea. "That's a good idea," I said lightly. "They're known for being flexible with the right clients." I let the words hang in the air, just enough to plant the seed without pointing a finger. Daniel nodded, already making a note to contact them. He had no idea that the bank he was about to approach was my own. That evening, I found myself thinking back to the day I'd acquired controlling shares in XYZ Bank. It had been 2 years before I met Daniel. I'd been tracking the bank for months, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Evelyn, desperate to cover a stalled project, sold off a significant block of her shares at a loss. She probably never even looked at the buyer's name. I had purchased them quietly through a holding company, eventually securing a majority stake. It wasn't personal back then, it was just business. Now, the irony was almost poetic. Daniel, unaware of this history, still saw me as the supportive wife who occasionally asked smart questions about his work, but kept her own life neatly separate. I let him believe that. The more invisible I was in this game, the more control I had. 2 days later, the first whispers appeared online. A small blog posted a story suggesting I had married into wealth after a series of failed business ventures. The claims were laughable, but the timing wasn't. Within hours, larger outlets picked it up, adding their own spin. From startup struggles to mansion life. The Rachel Morgan story. One headline read, "They used carefully cropped photos, some from before my marriage, paired with captions designed to erode credibility. I traced the smear campaign back to an anonymous investment fund. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Alice, my sister-in-law, had funneled money into the fund through an offshore account. She hadn't just tried to undermine me socially. She was making a strategic move to weaken me before the loan negotiation." Daniel read one of the articles over breakfast, his brow furrowed. "Is there something you haven't told me?" he asked, his tone too casual to be genuine. I looked up from my coffee, feeling the first real crack in our marriage. "I've told you everything that matters," I said. He nodded, but his eyes stayed guarded. The tension between us thickened. At family dinners, Alice's smirk grew more pronounced, Evelyn's comments more barbed. Meanwhile, the media storm gathered speed. Talk show hosts speculated about whether I was a strategic opportunist or just lucky. One national news anchor with a smirk in her voice called me the most dangerous woman in the city, not for her power, but for her patience. I didn't respond publicly. I couldn't afford to. Every move I made was being watched, twisted, amplified. But in the privacy of my office, I built my counterstrike. I gathered proof of Alice's offshore transactions, evidence of Evelyn's over-leveraging, and a trail that connected their financial desperation directly to the loan application now sitting in my drawer. Still, the damage was real. Invitations to certain events quietly stopped coming. A charity board I'd served on for years suddenly restructured me out of my position. Even some of my own contacts began to treat me like a liability. The lowest point came when I turned on the television one night and saw my face plastered across the screen. The chyron read, "Gold Digger" or "Financial Genius. The Truth About Rachel Morgan." The host, a sharp-tongued commentator with millions of viewers, called me calculating, and "a woman who makes power plays under the guise of domestic harmony." The audience laughed. I muted the volume, staring at my own image, feeling the weight of the narrative they were crafting. They thought this would break me. What they didn't know was that the game had only just begun. The morning I decided to end the charade, the city skyline was still wrapped in fog. My phone was already buzzing with notifications, but I ignored them as I reviewed the final draft of the report. The audit team had done their work well. Every unpaid invoice, every missed payment, every loan default from Morgan & Hale was laid out in sharp, undeniable detail. I called my assistant into the office. Book a live stream slot. I want it across all major platforms. YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn. Noon. Her eyebrows rose. Under your name? No, I said, closing the folder. Under my title. By 12 o'clock, the camera was on, the lighting harsh and honest. I looked directly into the lens, my voice steady. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Morgan. For the last 3 years, I have served as the majority shareholder of XYZ Bank. Today, I am releasing the full independent audit of Morgan & Hale Real Estate Development. I paused just long enough for the words to sink in. This is not a rumor. These are facts. I held up the thick report, then flipped it open to a page marked in red. As of last quarter, Morgan & Hale holds over $30 million in outstanding debt, including multiple delinquent payments to contractors and suppliers. They have used personal property as collateral, putting private family assets at risk. The live stream chat exploded. I could see the comments flashing by. Shock, disbelief, vindication. Within minutes, clips of my announcement began flooding social media. The hashtag Honor Queen Rachel surged to the top of trending lists. People spliced my calm delivery over dramatic music, turning the broadcast into a viral rallying cry. An hour later, I received a terse email from Evelyn requesting an urgent meeting. I responded with a calendar link offering one slot, tomorrow morning at my office. When she arrived, she was dressed as impeccably as ever, her pearls perfectly aligned, her posture rigid. Daniel followed a step behind, his jaw tight. They entered the glass-walled conference room, the skyline stretching behind me like a crown. Evelyn took the seat opposite mine, her eyes cool but wary. Mrs. Morgan, I began, savoring the way her name felt under my control. Thank you for coming. We have business to discuss. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You've humiliated my family. I've presented the truth, I corrected. The humiliation is just the side effect of transparency. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. I slid the loan contract across the table. The bank is prepared to approve your request, under certain conditions. The conditions were spelled out in clean, decisive language, full financial oversight of the Hale project, a binding clause requiring public acknowledgement of the bank's role in saving it, and an on-record statement from Evelyn herself recognizing my position and authority. Evelyn read the first page, her knuckles whitening around the paper. This is extortion. This is business, I said evenly. And I'm offering you terms that will keep your company alive. Decline, and you can explain to your investors why the only bank willing to take your file withdrew. Daniel's eyes met mine, but this time there was no warmth, only a flicker of hurt. He knew I was winning, but not on the terms he wanted. Eventually, Evelyn signed. The pen made a sharp, final sound against the paper. She looked up, her voice clipped. Mrs. Morgan, you have your deal. 2 days later, the press conference unfolded just as I had planned. Evelyn stood at the podium, the bank's logo gleaming on the backdrop. Cameras clicked in rapid succession as she read her prepared statement. I want to publicly thank Mrs. Rachel Morgan for her decisive action in securing the future of the Hale project. Her leadership and commitment to excellence have been invaluable. The words tasted like acid in her mouth, but the cameras caught every syllable. The photo of us shaking hands afterward would be printed in every business journal by morning. From a distance, it looked like victory. The bank gained control of the project. I gained leverage in every future family interaction, and Evelyn had been forced to acknowledge me in the most public way possible. But behind closed doors, the cost was clear. Daniel had been distant since the meeting. That night, as we sat in the living room, he finally spoke. You could have told me, he said quietly, about the bank, about the shares, about all of it. I closed my laptop. I did what I had to do. I'm your husband, Rachel. I'm not supposed to find out about my wife's life on a live stream. There was no accusation in his tone, just a hollow kind of disappointment that stung more than anger would have. I wanted to explain that I'd kept my silence to protect both of us, but I knew it would sound like an excuse. As the night stretched on, I realized that while I had secured the project, the Morgans' compliance, and the public's admiration, I had also drawn an invisible line between myself and Daniel. I had built a fortress so strong that even he wasn't allowed inside. For the first time since this began, the taste of victory felt bittersweet. The headlines hadn't stopped. Queen Rachel Saves Hale Project sat beside Cold-Blooded or Brilliant on the business pages. Overnight, the boardroom doors that had once been closed to me swung wide open, but so did the crosshairs. The city's power brokers knew my name now, and not all of them liked the way I'd earned it. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in, private luncheons, charity galas, closed-door investor meetings. Every handshake was warm, every smile polished, but beneath the politeness, I could sense the scrutiny. They wanted to know if I was the kind of woman they could manipulate or the kind they'd have to take down. It didn't take long for whispers to start. At one dinner, a man leaned across the table, swirling his wine, and said, "You're a shark in silk, Mrs. Morgan. I almost feel sorry for your mother-in-law." His tone made it clear he didn't feel sorry at all. He was admiring the spectacle. Others weren't so generous. A popular business podcast accused me of killing Evelyn Morgan's career for sport. They ignored the facts, preferring the neater narrative of a ruthless daughter-in-law out for blood. The public image I'd built was sharp, unflinching, but at home, things were brittle. Daniel no longer reached for my hand when we walked into a room. He asked fewer questions about my day, and when he did, there was a hesitation in his voice, as if he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. One night, over dinner, he finally said what had been simmering. "I don't know if I'm sleeping next to my wife or my opponent." His words hit harder than any headline. I wanted to remind him that every move I'd made had been to protect both of us, but I knew he wouldn't see it that way. The gulf between us was growing, and I didn't know how to bridge it without surrendering the very power I'd fought to claim. It was during one of my late nights at the bank that the real storm began to take shape. I was reviewing quarterly reports when I noticed a pattern in our loan default cases. Several of them traced back to shell companies that, on paper, had no connection to one another. But the trail was there if you knew where to look. I followed it through a labyrinth of holding firms and offshore accounts until a name emerged: Corinthian Capital. Corinthian wasn't just another faceless investment giant. 10 years ago, they had tried to buy my first company at a fraction of its value. When I refused, they launched a smear campaign so vicious it nearly destroyed me. I'd fought back then and won, but the victory had been costly. Seeing their name now, linked to the Morgans' financial collapse, was like finding the ghost of an old war at my doorstep. The next day, I dug deeper. Evelyn's debt crisis hadn't been the result of simple mismanagement. It had been engineered. Corinthian had deliberately pulled funding from key projects, forcing her to sell shares and scramble for capital. The move had pushed her into my bank's arms, where they assumed I'd either be too cautious to approve the loan or too reckless to protect my position. I wasn't sure whether to feel angry or impressed. It was a clean play, and it was working, until I stepped in. Still, there was one piece I couldn't fit. How had Corinthian gotten such detailed information about the Morgans' finances and my own strategic holdings? The answer came in a way I didn't expect. Alex Carter, the journalist I'd been feeding information to, called me late one night. His voice was tight. "Rachel, you need to know this. Someone inside your circle has been passing data to Corinthian, not just business records, personal stuff." I braced myself. "Who?" There was a pause. Then he said the name I'd never imagined hearing. Claire. Claire Hastings. My closest friend since college, the woman who had held my hand when I signed the papers to sell my first company. The one who had celebrated every victory and grieved every loss by my side. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Alex continued, She's been on their payroll for at least a year. They've been paying her through a consultancy front. I can send you the documents." When the email arrived, the evidence was indisputable. Contracts, bank transfers, even encrypted messages arranging meetings with Corinthian executives. Claire had been feeding them intel since before my marriage, positioning herself as my confidant while delivering my playbook to the enemy. I sat alone in my office long after midnight, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor. In one hand, I held the printout of Claire's transactions. In the other, the contract Evelyn had signed with my bank. For all my careful planning, I'd been fighting the wrong enemy. Evelyn had never been the true threat. She was just the pawn Corinthian had chosen to move first. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought a cold, quiet fury. If they wanted a war, I would give them one. But this time, it wouldn't just be about protecting what I'd built. It would be about dismantling theirs, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ashes. By the time the sun rose over the city the next morning, I had my plan. Corinthian capital had spent years perfecting a model of control. Centralized power, quiet intimidation, backroom deals. I would dismantle it by doing the one thing they'd never anticipate, giving my power away. That afternoon, in a live press conference streamed to millions, I announced a radical restructuring of XYZ Bank. Effective immediately, I said, we will be opening 20% of our equity to small-scale investors, entrepreneurs, local business owners, and community members. No single entity will be allowed to hold more than 1%. My voice was calm, but I could feel the ripple moving through the audience. The press erupted with questions, but I kept my focus on the cameras. We will not be a fortress controlled by the few. We will be a foundation built by the many. Behind the scenes, the mechanics were already in motion. Shares were being divided, sold in controlled blocks, transferred into dozens of hands too small for Corinthian to buy out in one sweep. It was, in essence, a self-inflicted fracture, but one that made the whole stronger. They could not topple a tower that was no longer a single structure. The hardest part came next. In my private office, I drew up the papers to transfer 10% of my personal holdings to Daniel. When I slid the documents across the kitchen table that evening, he stared at them like they were written in another language. "This is your control," he said. "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because you're my husband," I replied, "and because I need you to know that I'm not building this against you. I'm building it for us." He was silent for a long moment, then signed. For the first time in months, his hand closed around mine without hesitation. The transformation within the bank was immediate. Departments that had once been opaque opened their books. Employees who'd been hesitant to speak began offering ideas. The shift spread beyond our walls. Local news outlets hailed the move as a blueprint for financial democracy, and independent investors rallied behind us. Corinthian's influence began to wane. Their usual tactics rendered useless against a structure too dispersed to capture. 3 months later, at the annual shareholders meeting, Evelyn stood at the podium. She was thinner, her edges softened by the blows she'd taken. In front of hundreds of attendees and a dozen news cameras, she said, "I want to acknowledge my daughter-in-law, Rachel Morgan, for her vision and her courage. Without her, neither this bank nor my company would be standing here today. She has been a daughter to me." The words, though measured, were genuine enough to catch me off guard. I smiled, not out of triumph, but out of something closer to peace. The war I'd fought had begun with a wedding photo cropped in half. Now, standing here, I felt whole in a way I hadn't in years. In the quiet months that followed, I began writing. The book poured out of me in the early mornings before the city woke, less a memoir than a blueprint, filled with the hard lessons no business school taught. I titled it, "Power Isn't Inherited, It's Built." It wasn't about the Morgans or even Corinthian. It was about the idea that strength is something you craft piece by piece until it stands on its own. When it was finished, I placed the final manuscript in a drawer, knowing it would outlive the headlines, the boardroom battles, even me. My legacy wouldn't just be the bank or the projects it funded. It would be the reminder that no one has the right to decide whether you belong. On the last page, I wrote a single sentence. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And once you've built it, no one can take it away. And for the first time, I closed the door on the past without looking back.